So, right now, you're probably watching Lionel Messi play on this completely climate controlled, perfectly manicured grass in front of literally billions of people.
Yeah, the scale is just massive today.
Right. And you might have even been one of the people watching that broadcast on June 22nd, just a few days ago, seeing a 38-year-old Messi step onto that pristine turf down at Dallas Stadium.
Incredible moment, honestly.
It really was. I mean, he scores that clinical brace against Austria, hits 18 career World Cup goals, and in that exact moment just shatters the all-time tournament scoring record.
Yeah.
And, the stadiums you're looking at now in 2026, they are high-tech marvels. The broadcast is like fully optimized for TikTok, and these athletes are basically global deities, right? Moving within this highly regulated multi-billion dollar machine.
It really does feel permanent, doesn't it? Like when you are standing inside one of those massive stadiums in the US or Canada or Mexico for this 48 nation tournament,
Oh, they're
right? The sheer scale of the infrastructure makes it feel as though this global game was just, I don't know, handed down from the mountaintop, fully formed.
Yeah, like it always existed this way. But I want to pull you entirely out of Dallas in 2026 for a minute. I want to rip you away from the climate control and drop you into freezing, wind-whipped London over 150 years ago.
A very different vibe.
Completely. The year is 1870, and the weather is so brutal that literal chunks of ice are floating down the River Thames.
Just miserable conditions.
Exactly. And on this freezing cricket ground, you've got 22 guys who are this bizarre mix of schoolboys and members of parliament, by the way. And they're running around in the mud and the biting wind, trying to play a game that you would barely even recognize today.
Chaos is honestly the only word for it. There were no global superstars,
Yeah.
no billion-dollar broadcast deals, and certainly no climate-controlled turf. It was just this really disparate group of men trying to figure out what they were actually doing.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are going to trace the fascinating, the messy, and honestly, the highly improbable transition of this sport based on our sources today.
Right.
We want to look at how we got from those freezing, unofficial ragtag matches in the 1870s to the hyper regulated, modern, global tournament era that you are witnessing right now.
Yeah, it's all about understanding the mechanics of that evolution.
Yeah.
Because the tactical DNA of today's complex battles, the intricate passing networks,
Yeah.
the spatial
The stuff
awareness.
that makes the modern game so beautiful.
Exactly. The very rules that dictate how a player like Kylian Mbappe attacks a defensive line today, all of that was entirely forged in those chaotic early Victorian clashes.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. But I mean, the path to globalization couldn't even happen until they solved a much more basic problem.
Right. Well, I am looking at my notes here. And before we even get to the idea of two nations playing each other, there's a massive preliminary hurdle. People didn't even agree on what sport they were playing.
Not at all.
I mean, humans have always kicked things, clearly, but there was no universal rule book. I see mentions here in the source material of ancient precursors, like there's a Chinese game called Kuju and a Roman game called Harpastum. What actually were those?
Well, so Cuju roughly translates to kicking ball, and it dates way back to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC in China.
Wow, that long ago.
Yeah, during the Han Dynasty. But it wasn't just a leisurely courtyard game. It actually originated as a rigorous military training exercise.
Like military training, like boot camp.
Exactly. The soldiers used a leather ball, but it was stuffed with feathers or animal fur.
A leather ball stuffed with feathers? That doesn't sound like it would bounce at all.
It didn't. I mean, it didn't need to bounce in the modern sense. The whole objective was to kick this heavy, awkward ball through a very small opening in a silk sheet.
A silk sheet.
Yeah, and that silk sheet was strung up between bamboo poles roughly 9 meters high in the air.
9 meters. That is almost 30 feet. That's basically kicking a medicine ball through a basketball hoop that's 3 times higher than normal.
Right, it required immense skill.
Hmm.
And over time, military manuals like the Zhangguosei documented its transition. It went from the military into this highly popular public entertainment and courtly sport.
Okay.
And they actually had standardized rules for it. And then the Romans, later on, they played Harpastum, which was just a grueling, heavily physical ball game.
Sounds very Roman.
Yeah, very combative. But it just shows that the human impulse to play with a ball using the feet is completely cross-cultural.
So we have these ancient versions, but if we fast forward to Europe in like the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the notes describe something historians literally call mob football.
Yes. Mob football.
If I am trying to visualize mob football, what am I actually picturing here?
You're picturing absolute mayhem. Just think of entire parishes or neighboring villages turning out to play against each other.
Like the whole town.
You might have hundreds of people on each side. There were no marked boundaries, no designated pitch, and basically no overarching rules.
So what was the point? How do you win?
The goal might simply be to force the ball, which was often an inflated pig's bladder, into the center of the rival village.
Hmm,
It was incredibly violent.
I bet.
I mean, it resulted in broken bones, destroyed property, you name it.
Just a literal tidal wave of humanity pushing a pig bladder through a town square.
Exactly.
Mm,
And because it was so destructive to local commerce and daily life, various monarchs repeatedly tried to ban it.
that makes sense.
They saw it as a dangerous public nuisance. The shift away from that only really begins in 19th century Britain, and it's driven largely by the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution. Wait, how does building factories and steam engines lead to standardizing football? I don't see the connection.
Well, rapid urbanization meant that the open spaces where these folk games were traditionally played were disappearing,
Oh, they were building over the fields.
right? Swallowed up by factories and housing. And concurrently, you have the rise of the Victorian public school system. So places like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Westminster, Winchester.
Okay, the fancy schools.
Exactly. The headmasters at these schools, they wanted to harness the aggressive energy of their young gentlemen. They needed to turn this chaotic mob violence into a structured recreational activity, to instill discipline and physical fitness.
But didn't every school just make up their own version of the game?
They did. That was the problem. If you went to rugby, for example, you played on a vast, muddy field. So handling the ball and tackling became a core part of the local culture.
Makes sense. You fall in the mud, it's fine.
But if you went to a school with tight, flagstoned cloisters, kicking a heavy ball or tackling someone onto solid stone was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, you'd crack your skull open.
Right, so those schools developed a game focused much more on close footwork and dribbling.
So these boys eventually graduate, right? They head off to university at Cambridge. They all want to play football on a Tuesday afternoon, and nobody can agree on the rules.
It resulted in endless arguments. I mean, a player from Eton would kick someone in the shins, thinking he was perfectly legal, and a player from another school would call it a blatant foul.
Right.
You cannot have a functional sport, let alone a competition, if you spend the first hour of every afternoon arguing over the baseline parameters of reality on the pitch.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like trying to host a massive international board game tournament, but half the tables think they're playing chess, and the other half are tackling each other like it's rugby.
That's a perfect analogy.
Which leads us to the first major attempt to actually fix this in 1848. I have a note here about a guy named Charles Thring.
Yes, Charles Bering. He was a key figure among a committee of Cambridge University students who finally decided they had to synthesize all these conflicting school rules into one coherent document.
Okay.
So they drafted what became known as the Cambridge Rules.
Uh,
And to make sure everyone saw them, they literally nailed these 11 rules to the trees on a piece of public parkland in Cambridge called Parker's Piece.
Nailing the rules to a tree feels very dramatic, like Martin Luther hammering his theses to the church door. What was the most significant thing Thring and his committee actually changed?
The most profound change was that the Cambridge Rules explicitly prohibited running with the ball in your hands.
Oh, wow.
You could still catch it out of the air under certain strict conditions, but you could not tuck it under your arm and sprint down the field. That was a massive line in the sand separating the kicking game from the handling game.
But Cambridge was just for the wealthy university elite, right?
Yeah.
If I'm looking at the timeline out in the working class communities, things were evolving entirely independently.
They were.
And this brings us to a massive breakthrough in 1858 with something called the Sheffield rules.
The Sheffield rules are arguably the true mechanical foundation of the modern game. In 1857, the Sheffield Football Club was founded by two sportsmen, Nathaniel Creswick, who was a solicitor, and William Prest, a wine merchant.
And they just wanted to stay in shape for cricket, right? Like this wasn't some grand football vision.
That was the initial motivation, yeah. They organized informal football matches in the winter months just to maintain their fitness for the summer cricket season.
That is so funny.
By 1858, they formalized their Sheffield rules. And it's fascinating because while the university boys were arguing over philosophy, these working class sportsmen in a steel town were innovating the actual mechanics of play.
I am reading this list of things they introduced in the source material, and it is staggering how much we owe to a couple of cricket players. I mean, they gave us the corner kick, they introduced free kicks for fouls, and wait, before this, they were apparently just using string to mark the top of the goal.
A literal piece of tape or string stretched between two
That's
posts. The
hilarious.
Sheffield rules finally mandated a solid wooden crossbar.
But the detail that absolutely blew my mind was the abolition of the fair catch. Help me understand this. What was a fair catch, and why did getting rid of it change everything?
Under many of the older rules, if the ball was lofted high into the air, a player could legally catch it with their hands, plant their heel in the mud, and claim a fair catch.
And what did that do?
It would award them a free kick, but it stopped the flow of the game entirely. The Sheffield rules abolished that. They said if the ball is in the air, you can no longer use your hands to catch it.
So, if a heavy, wet leather ball is flying directly at your face, and the rules suddenly tell you that you cannot put your hands up to catch it, what do you do?
You use your head.
That is incredible. The
Ah,
simple act of telling players they couldn't catch a flying ball anymore directly necessitated the invention of heading.
exactly.
The dramatic soaring headers we see in the penalty box today exist because two guys in 1858 wanted to keep the game moving for their winter cricket fitness routine.
It just shows how rules dictate physical kinematics. The human body adapts to the constraints placed upon it by the law book. However, despite the innovations in Cambridge and Sheffield, the country as a whole was still deeply fragmented.
We still don't have one game, we just have better regional games.
Therefore, a decisive moment was required. On October 26, 1863, a solicitor named Ebenezer Cobb Morley called a meeting at the Freemasons Tavern on Great Queen Street in London.
Okay, setting the scene.
He gathered representatives from a dozen London and suburban clubs with the singular goal: hammer out one universal, standardized set of rules. This meeting resulted in the birth of the Football Association, the FA.
I am picturing a bunch of Victorian gentlemen smoking pipes and politely debating, but the notes indicate this was actually a vicious, bitter argument that basically split the sporting world in half.
It was a true schism. The fundamental breaking point was over a practice called hacking.
Deliberately kicking a guy in the shins.
Exactly that. Running up and violently kicking your opponent's shins. A specific faction of the clubs, heavily represented by the Blackheath Club, believed that hacking was a vital, necessary test of masculine courage.
You're kidding.
No, they argued that if you took away hacking, you would neuter the sport. You would make it too soft, too delicate.
They were defending the right to kick people in the bones to preserve masculinity.
To them, enduring pain without complaint was the entire point of the exercise. But Ebenezer Cobb Morley and the majority of the FA voted to totally ban hacking and to ban carrying the ball in the hands.
So the pro hacking faction loses the vote? What do?
They walked out of the Freemasons Tavern.
Yeah.
They refused to compromise.
Yeah.
And that faction eventually went on to form Rugby.
Wow.
That single argument in 1863 formalized the permanent split between association football and rugby union.
The magnitude of that meeting is wild. I mean, if they had voted the other way, the 2026 World Cup might just be a global shin kicking tournament.
It very well could be.
But because the FA held firm, they established their 13 original laws of the game. They finally had a standardized rule book.
And standardization was the required catalyst for globalization. You cannot export a sport across borders if you cannot write down its rules in a uniform, transportable way.
So the FA has their golden rules. They're feeling confident they want to test this out, right? They want to prove their association game is superior to the handling game. So they decide they want to play an international match against Scotland. But trying to organize this in 1870 sounds like an absolute nightmare of logistics.
The driving force here was the secretary of the FA, a man named Charles Alcock.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant administrator and one of the premier players of his era. In January 1870, Alcock placed notices in newspapers, including papers up in Scotland, issuing a challenge.
Okay.
He wanted a Scotch 11 to face an English 11 at the Kennington Oval in London, played strictly under the FA's association rules.
They set the date, they have the challenge out there, but they immediately run into a problem that Ebenezer Cobb Morley's rulebook couldn't solve: the British weather.
Oh, early 1870 was gripped by a brutal freeze. They actually had to delay the match by 2 full weeks. The temperature was so low that massive, jagged blocks of ice were literally floating down the River Thames.
That is terrifying. So when they finally do take the pitch on March 5, 1870, the conditions are still miserable: high winds, freezing cold. Yet the notes say 5 to 600 people actually showed up to watch this.
Curiosity drove them. It was a novel spectacle. But the teams themselves are a fascinating reflection of how informal the sport still was. I mean, the concept of a rigid national team with dedicated professionals just did not exist.
I am looking at the rosters here, and it is absurd. You have sitting members of parliament playing alongside teenagers.
Yes.
For Scotland, you have Willie Gladstone playing defense. He is an MP and the literal son of the sitting Prime Minister, William Gladstone.
The lines between elite political society and amateur athletics were virtually non existent.
And for England, they field a 16-year-old schoolboy named Walpole Vidal. Imagine being a 16-year-old kid showing up to a freezing cricket ground and you are lining up against the Prime Minister's son.
It's quite the image. The team captain for England was Charles Alcock himself. And a key figure for the Scottish side was Arthur Kinnaird. Kinnaird was from a wealthy banking family. He was a ferocious player, and he would later go on to become the president of the FA.
So we have this freezing, chaotic match, and eventually somebody has to score the first international goal. And it isn't the Prime Minister's son, and it isn't Alcock. It is a 17-year-old Scottish schoolboy named Robert Crawford.
Yes, Robert Crawford's moment came about 15 minutes before the end of the match. Contemporary newspaper reports described it as a rather fluky long kick that found its way into the net.
A fluky long kick.
Yeah.
So he just boots it, the wind catches it, and suddenly he's a trivia answer for the rest of time.
But when I look at the rest of Crawford's life in the source material, it is incredibly dark. This is not a triumphant sports biography.
No, it is a deeply tragic human story. Robert Crawford scored that historic first goal and later became a highly decorated war hero in the British military.
Right. However, his life deteriorated terribly. He ended his life in absolute disgrace, having been convicted of a brutal murder.
Oh, wow.
Because of the sheer scandal of his later life, his monumental place in Scottish sporting legend was completely brushed under the carpet by the authorities and just forgotten for
Yeah,
decades.
a completely erased legacy. And to add to the irony, his fluky long kick didn't even win Scotland the match. The notes say an English player named Alfred Baker made a brilliant solo run in the dying moments of the game and scored. So the final whistle blows, and the first international finishes as a 1-1 draw.
A draw on the scoreboard, yes.
Yeah.
But the match itself featured a massive historical quirk regarding the laws of the game that we completely take for granted today.
You're talking about halftime.
I am.
I read this and had to do a double take. Halftime wasn't always a thing.
It had to be invented. Just 2 weeks prior to this 1870 match, the FA passed a brand new regulation. The rule stated that if no goal was scored in the first half of the allotted playing time, the teams would be required to change ends.
Wait, so before that, you just stayed on the same side of the field for the entire game unless someone scored?
Yes.
What if the wind was blowing sideways for 90 minutes? One team just suffered the whole time.
Precisely. They finally realized the environmental unfairness of that system. Since neither England nor Scotland scored in the first half of that March 1870 match, the referee instructed them to switch ends. It became one of the very first documented matches in history to utilize a formal halftime.
That is just wild. So we have a match. We have an English team and a Scottish team. We have a goal from a tragic schoolboy, an equalizer, and the invention of halftime. Yet, if you walk into FIFA headquarters today and ask to see the record for the first international match, they will tell you this 1870 game does not count.
They will.
It is officially unrecognized. Why?
This raises an important question, and the rejection comes down to the politics of national representation. When the detailed match report was published up north in the Glasgow Herald, it provoked an immediate and massive backlash from the sporting public in Scotland.
Because they looked at the roster and realized something is off.
They realized that the Scottish team Charles Alcock had assembled was comprised entirely of Scottish expatriates who lived full time in London.
So Alcock just went to the local London gentlemen's clubs, found guys with Scottish last names or heritage, and handed them a shirt.
That was certainly the perception in Glasgow. The clubs in Scotland were furious. One correspondent wrote a scathing letter to the newspapers declaring that a London based team had no right to reflect their national reputation as athletes.
And to play devil's advocate for the Scottish clubs, most of them preferred the handling game rugby anyway.
Right.
They weren't affiliated with the FA in London. They felt like London was dictating to them what their national identity should be on a football pitch.
Alcock defended himself in the press, of course. He argued that he had placed advertisements in Scottish newspapers and that the right to play was open to any Scotsman who was willing to travel down to London.
Look,
Exactly. In an era before commercial air travel or easy rail links, expecting amateur working men to travel from Glasgow to London for a Tuesday match was absurd.
the friction from this exchange of angry letters actually pushed the handling enthusiasts in Scotland to formally organize. They formed the Rugby Football Union in 1871 and hosted their own first Rugby International in Edinburgh.
And the grumblings got so loud that the English FA realized they had a real PR problem. If they truly wanted to prove the superiority of their association rules, and if they wanted a legitimate victory over Scotland, they couldn't just play expatriates in London.
Right.
They had to physically cross the border.
They had to go into enemy territory. And this decision to travel north in 1872 is the moment the tactical blueprint of football changes forever. We move from just kicking a ball around to actual strategy.
The date is November 30th, 1872. The English team travels to Hamilton Crescent in Partick, Glasgow, which was the West of Scotland Cricket Club's ground. Because the English team formally crossed the border to play a team of players actually based in Scotland, FIFA officially recognizes this 1872 clash as the first true international football match.
The notes say about 4,000 fans paid a shilling each to watch this. But the Scottish squad they put together was entirely unique. They didn't have a massive pool of association players to draw from, did they?
They had almost none. There was only one club in all of Scotland at the time that played by the FA's association rules instead of rugby rules, and that was Queen's Park of Glasgow.
So the Scottish national team wasn't an all-star team. It was literally just the Queen's Park Club team putting on national jerseys.
Out of pure necessity, yes. The entire starting 11 for Scotland played for the exact same club,
Mm.
but that limitation turned into their greatest asset.
How?
Because they practiced together constantly, they possessed a level of cohesion that the English All Star team completely lacked. And that cohesion catalyzed a tactical revolution.
Okay, I really need you to help me visualize this because I am looking at the formations they used in this 1872 match, and it sounds like a joke.
It's hard to grasp today.
The English team rolls into Glasgow playing a 1-1-8 formation. Sometimes it's listed as a 1-2-7. Wait, one defender. How does a 1-1-8 even function geometrically on a pitch? What is the one guy in the back doing?
To understand a 118, you have to discard everything you know about modern spatial distribution. The philosophy of the English game was entirely based on dribbling.
But when you say dribbling in 1872, you don't mean a player like Messi dancing around defenders with the ball glued to his foot, right?
No, Victorian dribbling was essentially a physical battering ram. A player would get the ball, put his head down, and simply charge forward as fast and as hard as he could.
Just sprinting straight ahead.
And his teammates would run directly behind him, backing him up in a tight physical scrimmage, very similar to a rugby forward pack.
So it's not a spread out attacking line, it's a wedge of 8 guys charging down the field together. That sounds like a glitch in a modern video game. How did anyone even defend that?
They relied heavily on the fact that their players were generally physically larger, heavier, and faster than the opposition. Passing the ball sideways was viewed almost as a sign of weakness, an admission that you couldn't beat your man physically.
Okay, so England has this massive 8-man stampede. And then you have the Scottish team, the Queen's Park guys. They look across the pitch. They're physically lighter. They are smaller. They know immediately that if they try to go toe to toe in a physical charging match with these heavy English players, they are going to get flattened.
Exactly. So Scotland lines up in a 2-2-6 formation, still incredibly forward heavy by modern standards, but structurally much more balanced than England.
Right.
But the formation wasn't their secret weapon. Their secret weapon was how they decided to move the ball.
It's like a matador versus a bull. The English are the bull, relying entirely on mass and forward momentum. The Scottish realize they can't stop the bull by standing in front of it, so they just keep moving the red cape.
They invented combination play. Today, we just call it passing.
They invented passing, like just the concept of passing.
As a systemic tactical philosophy, yes. Because the Queen's Park players knew each other's habits and movements intimately, they decided not to indulge in high, long balls or physical dribbling. Instead, when the English wedge charged at them, they
Ah.
simply passed the ball sideways or diagonally to an open teammate.
Denying the English the physical contact they wanted.
Exactly. They systematically passed the ball around the English players, neutralizing their physical superiority by making them chase shadows.
Ah,
Contemporary newspaper reports were mesmerized by it, calling it pattern weaving.
pattern weaving. That is so poetic. That is basically the 1872 ancestor of modern tiki taka.
It really is.
What fascinates me here is that the passing game wasn't born out of some grand philosophical ideal of beautiful football. It was born out of pure, desperate self preservation. They passed the ball out of fear of getting physically destroyed.
Innovation is almost always driven by necessity, and the strategy worked brilliantly. The match ended in a 0-0 draw, but strategically, it was universally viewed as a massive victory for Scotland.
Because they survived.
They proved that cohesion and intelligence could completely neutralize brute force. The English players and administrators returned to London, realizing their individual dribbling game was suddenly obsolete.
The tactical shift is monumental, but the minor details of this 1872 match are just so funny to me. We're talking about the first official international, and they still didn't have crossbars in Scotland. They just stretched a piece of tape between the goalposts.
The rules were in a constant state of flux. For instance, the rule for throw ins at the time awarded possession to whichever team's player was the first to physically touch the ball after it went out of bounds, regardless of who kicked it out.
Wait, really? So a guy kicks the ball 50 yards out of bounds, and then it's just a chaotic foot race to the sideline to see who can tag the ball first.
A literal sprint into the crowd to touch the leather.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was chaotic. Furthermore, the concept of specialized positions was still loose. The Scottish and English goalkeepers, Robert Gardner and Robert Barker, both decided they wanted to run out, so they literally rotated out of goal to play outfield positions at halftime.
You cannot imagine the goalie for England at the 2026 World Cup just deciding to play striker for the second half. It was such a wild transitional era.
It was, but the success of that 1872 match was profound. It kickstarted an absolute revolution in Scottish football. Suddenly, it wasn't just Queen's Park anymore. New clubs formed rapidly. Just a few months later, in March 1873, the Scottish Football Association was officially founded,
So Scotland says we have our own style, our own teams, we are governing ourselves.
which meant any pretensions the London FA had of dictating the game for the entire United Kingdom completely evaporated. Scotland was forging its own independent path.
Which brings up a socio-political dynamic that I find deeply compelling in the notes. We move toward the dawn of the 20th century. The British invented the codified game. They created the first international matches. They have the FA and the Scottish FA.
Right.
But their attitude toward the rest of the world was incredibly arrogant, and it almost isolated them from the game's global explosion.
The socio-political climate of Edwardian Britain was heavily defined by imperial confidence. By the early 1900s, football was spreading like wildfire across continental Europe and South America, largely carried by British sailors, railway engineers, and expatriates.
So everyone is playing the British game.
Yes, and because everyone is playing it, the need for an overarching global governing body became glaringly obvious. The European nations assumed the natural leader for this international federation would be the English FA, as the authors of the original rules.
But when the Europeans approached London, the British essentially slammed the door in their faces.
Lord Kinnaird, who, if you remember, had played in that freezing 1870 match and was now FA president, and the home nations flat out rejected the idea of joining a global federation.
Why? Was it
And
just pure snobbery?
it was a mixture of supreme arrogance and a deep suspicion of continental administration. The British viewed their domestic structures as vastly superior.
Okay.
They felt that entangling themselves with European nations would force them to compromise on their rigid definitions of amateurism and professional play. They essentially said, "We invented this, we are the best at it, and we do not need to sit at a table with you to legitimize it."
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Hmm.
They are offered the keys to a global empire of sport, and they turn it down because they feel too superior to share the room. That decision effectively gives away their control of the sport.
It forced the continent to organize without them. Frustrated by this British isolationism, 7 European nations decided they couldn't wait for London's permission. Representatives from France, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland convened in Paris.
And out of that meeting in Paris, we get the birth of the modern beast.
On May 21st, 1904, they officially founded FIFA, and the man they elected as its very first president was a French journalist named Robert Guerin.
I have to pause on Robert Guerin because the notes say he was 28 years old when he was elected president of FIFA.
A 28-year-old journalist.
That is younger than most of the players competing in the 2026 World Cup today, and he is the guy laying the foundation for the organization that runs it all.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Guerin was a visionary administrator. What he accomplished with the creation of FIFA was an early masterclass in sports geopolitics and institution building. He drafted the foundational statutes that gave FIFA its power.
What kind of statutes? How do you force countries to listen to a 28-year-old journalist?
By establishing mutual recognition, the statutes declared that FIFA had exclusive authority over international matches. They ruled that players could only represent a maximum of 2 national associations in their lifetime, which stopped countries from just buying mercenary squads. Crucially, Guerin ensured that all FIFA members would strictly adhere to the FA's original laws of the game. By standardizing the administration globally, FIFA created a plug and play framework for exponential growth.
That's brilliant. He basically uses the English rulebook to build a house that the English aren't allowed to control.
Exactly. The English eventually realized their geopolitical mistake and joined FIFA the following year in 1905, but the damage was done. The administrative center of power had permanently shifted from London to the continent.
And FIFA doesn't just stay a European club, the borders start expanding rapidly. I see South Africa joining in 1909, Argentina and Chile in 1912, and the US and Canada in 1913.
The global footprint was expanding, but the tournament structure was still lacking. Football was included in the Olympic Games, but the Olympics were strictly amateur.
Which caused issues, I assume.
There were constant, bitter disputes over the definition of an amateur athlete. Some countries were covertly paying their players, leading to boycotts and endless political infighting.
Which is when another massive figure steps onto the stage. A guy whose name is literally stamped on the sport's history, Jules Rimet.
Jules Rimet took over as FIFA president in 1921. He is a monumental figure in sports history, serving as president for an astonishing 33 years. Rimet looked at the Olympic amateur disputes and realized FIFA needed its own completely independent world championship, one that embraced professional players.
He wants to build the ultimate stage.
He conceptualized and relentlessly pushed for it, eventually launching the inaugural FIFA World Cup in 1930, which was hosted by Uruguay. That singular decision by Rimet permanently established football's global economic and cultural framework.
It is an incredible story of growth, vision, and expansion for the men's game. However, while we are sitting here in the year 1921 praising Jules Rimet for expanding the men's game globally, the source material highlights a parallel narrative happening at the exact same time, and it is a much darker story about deliberate suppression.
It is vital context. The history of women's football in the early 20th century is a stark, jarring contrast to the men's expansion. To understand what was lost, you have to look at what was happening during World War I.
Right. With the men off fighting the war, the women took over the factories and they also took over the football pitches.
They did. Women's football in Britain exploded in popularity. Teams formed in the munitions factories. The most famous was the Dick Kerr ladies team from Preston.
I've read about them.
These women were not just playing quiet kickabouts in the park. They were playing in major stadiums in front of tens of thousands of people, drawing massive crowds and raising huge sums of money for war charities. The women's game was entering a legitimate golden age.
But then the war ends, the men come back. And the establishment looks at these women drawing 50,000 fans to a stadium, and they feel threatened.
Deeply threatened. Now, strictly reporting from the historical sources here, the FA viewed the popularity of the women's game as a direct challenge to the male dominated infrastructure. So in December 1921, the exact same year Jules Rimet takes over FIFA to grow the men's game, the English FA institutes a total draconian ban on women playing football on any FA affiliated
They
grounds.
literally locked them out of the stadiums. What was their public justification for this? They couldn't just say, "We're jealous of your ticket
They
sale."
relied heavily on the medical pseudoscience and moral protectionism of the era. The FA released a statement claiming the game of football was quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged.
Unsuitable.
The FA, backed by conservative doctors they cited in the press at the time, claimed that the physical contact and exertion of football posed a severe risk to female fertility and reproductive health.
Wow.
They argued the jarring motions of running and kicking could damage a woman's internal organs. Furthermore, they argued it destroyed feminine grace.
So they weaponized fake biology to protect their monopoly. And this wasn't just an isolated incident in England, right? I'm looking at this timeline in the sources, and this suppression was a global trend.
It was a systemic global reaction. Norway banned women's football in 1931. France instituted a ban in 1941. Brazil implemented a legally binding ban in 1941 under military rule, effectively making it a crime for women to play.
A crime. That is unbelievable.
And Germany followed suit with a ban in 1955.
That is staggering. They systematically stunted the growth of half the population's participation in the world's most popular sport for half a century.
It created a 50-year dark age for the women's game. Now, women still played, of course. They played in public parks, on barred rugby grounds, and they formed their own rogue associations. But they were locked out of the official infrastructure, the funding, and the coaching pipelines that the men enjoyed.
The bans weren't lifted until the late 1960s and 1970s. And the note here that really gets me is about the first official Women's World Cup. It took until 1991 for FIFA to actually back a Women's World Cup in China. And even then, they were so terrified of associating the prestigious World Cup brand with women that they refused to call it that.
They officially named it the World Championship for Women's Football for the M&M's Cup.
The M&M's Cup, I mean, you have Jules Rimet building a monument to men in 1930, and 60 years later, the women are handed the M&M's Cup.
The institutional resistance was profound. The global governance that accelerated the men's game actively worked to suppress the women's game. The legacy of that 50-year developmental gap is something the sport has been actively working to correct and overcome only in very recent decades.
It is a crucial piece of the puzzle. You cannot understand the landscape of modern football without understanding who was deliberately excluded from it. But as we pivot back to the men's World Cup structure maturing from 1930 onwards, the tournament becomes this massive global stage. And with a stage that large, you get the birth of a new kind of deity, the global football icon.
The evolution of the sport's tactics and global appeal can really be tracked through the statistical and narrative footprints of its greatest players. Each successive era of the World Cup demanded something different physically and tactically.
Right.
Certain players elevated themselves into immortality by completely defining the evolution of their time.
I am looking at this Striver top 10 list from our sources, and you can see distinct eras mapped out. You start with the early geniuses. I see a French player named Just Fontaine.
Just Fontaine in the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. He achieved something that will almost certainly never be replicated. He scored 13 goals in a single tournament.
13 goals in one tournament. That
Yeah.
is absurd.
He scored in every single match he played in that World Cup. It represents an era where attacking flair could completely overwhelm nascent defensive structures.
But 1958 is also famous for the arrival of the ultimate icon.
Pele. In that exact same 1958 tournament, you have the emergence of a 17-year-old kid from Brazil,
Wait, Pele was 17 when he won his first World Cup.
17 years old.
Hmm.
He nets a hat trick in the semifinal and a brace in the final. Pele is synonymous with the World Cup because he is the only male player to win it 3 times 58, 62, and 70.
What made him so dominant across three different decades?
By the time he led the 1970s squad, he had evolved. He
Right.
wasn't just a raw athletic goal scorer anymore. He was the creative and emotional epicenter of what is widely considered the greatest international side ever assembled. His spatial awareness and joyful creativity defined the Brazilian Joga Bonito.
But then the game starts getting more structured, right? Defenses figure out they can't just let guys like Pele run wild. The 1970s bring in the era of the tactical innovators. The list highlights Franz Beckenbauer for West Germany. I have the word libero written in my notes here. I know it translates to sweeper, but if I'm watching Beckenbauer in 1974, what is a sweeper actually doing that is so revolutionary?
To understand the libero, you have to look at the defensive lines before Beckenbauer. Defenders were typically static, man marking brutes. They stayed in their zone and kicked the ball away. Beckenbauer realized that if he dropped slightly behind the main defensive line, he would have a panoramic view of the entire pitch.
So he gives himself a buffer zone to read the play.
Precisely. He would sweep up any balls that got through the line, hence the name. But what made Beckenbauer a genius was what he did after he won the ball.
What did he do?
Instead of just booting it into the stands, he would use his incredible technical ability to step forward, carry the ball out of defense, and orchestrate the attack from deep.
He became a playmaker operating out of the center back position.
He represented a profound shift from pure attacking flair to deep structural intelligence. His tactical discipline famously neutralized the fluid total football of Johan Cruyff's Netherlands in the 1974 final.
And a front Beckenbauer had Gerd Miller, a Der Bomber. The notes say he had 14 career World Cup goals. Just ruthless, unspectacular efficiency inside the penalty box.
Muller was the antithesis of a dribbler. He was a master of positioning and quick, predatory strikes in tight spaces.
So the 70s are all about this hyper intelligent structure. But then you jump into the 1980s, and structure gets completely thrown out the window by the one man armies. And the defining figure here is Diego Maradona in 1986.
Maradona's 1986 campaign in Mexico is widely considered the greatest individual performance in World Cup history. He essentially dragged an otherwise good, but not great, Argentine squad to a world championship.
When I look at footage from that era, what stands out to me isn't just the skill, it's the sheer physical toll these players took. Today, you watch a match and you have perfectly watered grass, VAR checking every angle, and referees strictly protecting the attackers.
It's very different now.
Maradona was playing on heavy, rough pitches, and defenders were allowed to absolutely hack him to pieces.
The physical punishment he absorbed was staggering.
Yeah.
Defenders would violently slide tackle him from behind, which was often only a yellow card offense at the time.
And despite getting battered, he still completely dominates. 5 goals, 5 assists in 1986. And he delivers the two most famous goals in football history in a single match against England.
The quarterfinal against England encapsulates the duality of his genius. First, you have the hand of God, where he uses pure cunning to illegally punch the ball into the net over the goalkeeper.
And the referee completely misses it.
And just 4 minutes later, he scores the goal of the century. He receives the ball in his own half, spins away from two players, and dribbles past half the English team with a low gravity balance and technical perfection that completely defied the defensive systems of his era.
Incredible.
He was operating on pure force of will.
But sports science improves. Defenders get faster, tactical systems get tighter, and we enter the era of the modern masters. Players who have to combine that raw flair with hyper athleticism. I see Ronaldo Nazario on here. Oh, phenomeno. The notes point to a crazy gap in his story between 1998 and 2002. What exactly happened there?
Ronaldo's story is arguably the greatest redemption arc in sports history. Going into the 1998 final in France, he was the most terrifying striker on the planet. But hours before the final, he suffered a mysterious medical emergency, a convulsive fit in his hotel room. He played the final like a ghost, and Brazil lost cleanly to France,
And then his body completely breaks down. We're
and
like,
suffered two devastating back to back knee tendon ruptures that sidelined him for the better part of 3 years. Many thought his career was over.
but he comes back.
Yet he rehabilitated, returned for the 2002 World Cup in South Korea and Japan, and scored 8 goals, including two in the final against Germany, to win the tournament.
An unbelievable comeback. And the player who beat him in that 98 final is also on this list. Zinedine Zidane.
Zidane dictated the absolute tempo of elite matches like a conductor. He was elegance personified. He carried France to the title in 98 with two headers in the final. He returned from international retirement to completely dominate the knockout stages of the 2006 tournament.
But his career ends in absolute infamy.
It is cinematic drama. In the final match of his entire career, the 2006 World Cup final, he reacts to an insult from Italian defender Marco Materazzi by violently headbutting him in the chest.
In front of the whole world.
He is sent off, and France loses on penalties.
The highest highs and the most shocking exit imaginable. And rounding out this evolution, the notes highlight a player who isn't known for cinematic drama, but for sheer modern efficiency. Miroslav Klose.
Klose is the ultimate World Cup specialist. He wasn't as flashy as Zidane or Ronaldo, but he epitomized modern structural consistency and spatial awareness. By constantly putting himself in exactly the right position across 4 different tournaments, he set the all time scoring record at 16 goals in 2014, helping Germany win the title.
Which brings us exactly to where we are today, June 2026. All of that history. The freezing Scottish MPs, the arguments in the Freemasons Tavern, the creation of FIFA, the evolution of these legendary players. It has all culminated in the massive spectacle of the current tournament.
The operational scale we are witnessing right now is staggering. We have shifted to a 48 team format. That is 104 matches spread across 3 massive nations: the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
The logistics of just moving the teams around that continent are mind boggling.
And because of the expansion, you have debutante nations stepping onto the global stage for the very first time. Countries like Cape Verde, Curacao, Jordan, and Uzbekistan are getting their first taste of World Cup football. The global reach Jules Rimet dreamed of in 1930 has fully materialized.
And we are watching live historic milestones happen in real time. Just a few days ago, on June 22nd, Lionel Messi rewrites the record books once again. He scores those 2 goals against Austria in Dallas.
Reaching 18 career World Cup goals.
He officially shatters Miroslav Klose's record. And you look at the scoring charts right now, and Kylian Mbappe is trailing right behind him with 16 goals, and Mbappe is only 27 years old.
Messi's achievement is a testament to how modern conditioning, sports science, and tactical systems allow legendary figures to extend their peak performance far longer than players in Maradona's or Pele's eras could.
But it's not just the players evolving, is it? The rule book is still changing. When I look at the new regulations introduced for this 2026 tournament, it feels like a different sport from even 20 years ago.
It is a profound shift. In accordance with IFB, the International Football Association Board FIFA has introduced highly specific rule changes designed almost entirely to kill time wasting and artificially increase the speed of play.
Contrast the 1863 argument over, is it okay to kick a guy in the shins for masculine courage with the 2026 rule book. Today we have 10-second substitutions.
The 10-second rule is ruthless. When your number goes up on the board, if you do not physically cross the touchline and exit the pitch within 10 seconds, Your replacement has to wait a full minute to come on,
Wow.
forcing your team to play with 10 men for 60 seconds.
So no more slow walking off the pitch, applauding the crowd, and hugging the referee to waste time. And I saw the referees actually have a visual 5-second restart countdown now.
Yes, for throw ins and goal kicks. If the player takes longer than 5 seconds to restart play, possession is immediately handed to the opposition. Furthermore, any outfield player who goes down needing medical treatment has to wait off the pitch for a mandatory minimum of 1 minute before being allowed back on.
Which completely stops players from faking injuries to break up an opponent's momentum. But the rule that has everyone talking, the most controversial one, is the mouth covering rule.
Automatic red cards for players who cover their mouths with their hand or their shirt to hide insults from lip readers while confronting an opponent.
It is zero tolerance. We also have mandatory 3-minute hydration breaks in every half now, regardless of the temperature in the stadium. And predictably, the broadcasters are using those 3 minutes to run massive commercial breaks.
The commercialization drives the rules. And even the foundational structures of the tournament have shifted. The tiebreakers for the group stage are different now.
Right. If two teams are tied on points in the group, it's no longer just about who has the better overall goal difference. The very first tiebreaker is now head to head points between the tied teams.
So, if we look at the entire arc of this conversation, what does this all mean?
We went from 22 guys freezing in London, arguing over rules and using a piece of tape for a crossbar, to dynamic ticket pricing, TikTok broadcast deals, zero tolerance mouth covering rules, and multi-billion-dollar broadcasting rights. It is an unrecognizable landscape.
What it means is that rule changes, whether they are drafted in a Victorian tavern or a modern corporate boardroom, are still the primary driver in the evolution of the sport. Just as banning catching the ball in 1858 forced players to invent the header, the 2026 anti time wasting rules are radically shifting the modern match tempo.
Yeah.
The sport is in a constant, restless state of engineering its own entertainment value to adapt to the era it exists within.
It is an incredible 150 plus year journey. From Charles Thring nailing rules to a tree in Cambridge to MPs playing on ice to Queen's Park inventing passing in Glasgow out of fear of getting crushed to the dark decades of suppressing the women's game, all the way to Messi breaking records in front of billions today.
Is the ultimate story of human play colliding with administrative structure and technological integration, constantly refining each other in real time.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the archives, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought from the source material. In June 2025, in preparation for this exact 2026 tournament, NASA conducted experiments aboard the International Space Station.
Yes.
Astronauts literally tested soccer balls in microgravity to study mass distribution and sensor technology, and that orbital research actually contributed to the design of the 2026 official match ball, the Trianda.
A football engineered with the help of orbital space science.
Exactly. So, if we went from inflating pig bladders and tying string between wooden posts in 1870 to zero gravity NASA ball engineering in 2026, I want you to ponder this. What will the World Cup look like 150 years from now? Will the game in the year 2176 be as unrecognizable to Messi and Mbappe as today's game would be to those freezing cricketers on the Thames? The evolution never stops. Keep that in mind the next time you sit down to watch a match.